Stakeholder.
In gambling, an independent party with whom each of those who make a wager deposits the money or counters wager.
A person with an interest or concern in something, especially a business.
In emergency management, any person or entity with a vested interest in the survival and recovery of a given community. You.
Welcome to Stakeholder Prepping.
Welcome back to Stakeholder Prepping, where you are the stakeholder in your own survival. My name is Chris.
And I'm AC. And this episode is a bit sobering. Because of the recent news about air disasters, we're going to talk about plane crashes, and specifically survivable airplane crashes.
Yeah, this is going to be a pretty heavy episode, and I certainly don't want us to come off as ambulance chaser podcast hosts that are just running after the latest big story, because this is important information. And although a lot of the incidents in the news lately have not been survivable, there certainly are things you can do to minimize your own risk when you're traveling by air. And we're going to break this down from a few different angles. And I don't want to scare anyone here because flying is still the safest way to get around. The safety stats on this are not going to lie, folks. The risk of dying in a commercial air flight has decreased significantly over time. For example, like just looking at the stats from 1968 to 1977, there was a risk of about 1 in 350,000 of dying during air travel. And from 2018 to 2022, that went down to 1 in 13.7 million.
Wow.
And that stat's even more amazing when you realize how many more airplanes there are up there today than there were 50 years ago. There's an MIT professor, his name is Arnold Barnett, who actually came up with the math on this one. And in the US, the next time you board a flight, your chances of dying are 1 in 60 million. So you could fly every day for the next 164,000 years and never even think of dying in an airplane crash, statistically speaking. And let's be honest, if flying was dangerous, I would not have a co-host. AC?
Yeah, so true. I will say that I am kind of an expert here. I guess you could say that maybe about 80% of my day is spent not dying in an airplane. But just so everyone understands how often I am flying, and it's amazing that we managed to get in the studio and do these as often as we do, because working for a defense contractor and being a pilot myself, I have about 3 million miles in the back of the airplane as a passenger, and I have about 700 hours of pilot and command time, including some jet time, some multi-engine time, along with some fun stick time and a few warbirds, and quite a few hours of single pilot IFR time without GPS. So if you remember we talked about some radio-based navigation back in the day. I was flying airplanes, single pilot IFR, meaning that's instrument flight rules. So where there is nothing out the window, you are in the clouds 100% and you have no GPS. So I have done a lot of that by myself in the cockpit with no co-pilot there to help you out, using these, radio-based navigation and a stopwatch and a paper map.
Were your paper maps from MyTopo?
Oh, that's a quality plug. They were not. They're called sectionals that pilots fly with. My Topo doesn't sell them, but you're right. There's no replacement for a paper map. So if you need one, use our link.
And last episode was all about insurance. That was kind of my realm of professional proness. And yours, this is all on air travel and air safety. This is definitely your realm of pro level. I guess I didn't realize how many miles you've actually flown on like commercial airplanes, because I'm decent at math and my math is saying that's like 120 times around the planet. And That's something like 250 days inside of an airborne aluminum tube.
Yeah, that's true. Some carbon fiber tubes though, those 787 Dreamliners, man, they're nice.
So I think it's fair to say you're an expert at not dying in an airplane. So what exactly are we going to be talking about today?
Well, exactly that, not dying in an airplane. So, we talked a little bit in episode 5 about the EDC gear that I take on the airplane. So, there'll be a couple of throwbacks, but really, I want people to understand just how survivable a lot of these air disasters are. And we don't have to look back very far to see how people on the exact same airplane can have gravely different outcomes. If you look back literally just on this last Christmas day, Christmas of last year, um, there was that Embraer 190AR that went down in Kazakhstan. It was reportedly shot down from inside Russian territory, and 38 people died on that airplane. But 29 people lived. And there's video from the scene that just show people walking away from the wreckage. So we want you to be one of those 29.
And this is a little bit heavy, so you're going to go over the stuff that we've always heard about, like sitting closer to the back of the airplane, right?
And basically, that kind of stuff. And to your point, it's not just about sitting closer to the rear of the airplane. It's often sitting close to an exit that makes an air disaster more survivable, specifically within 5 rows of an exit. But I don't just want to talk about like where to sit and how to assume the crash position. I think to make this one a little more engaging, I'd like to talk a little bit about what's going on in the cockpit as well and what types of things you should worry about and what types of things may seem worrisome but are just sort of normal parts of flying.
Okay, I think that's fair. And I do want to reference something in a book. Yes, we actually do research for these. So this comes from a book called The Survivors Club: The Secrets and Science That Could Save Your Life. It's by an author. His name is Ben Sherwood. And this book is now part of my prepper library, thanks to you recommending it, AC.
Sure.
But specifically in this book, it talks about how during survivable air disasters, people freeze. And it's not panic. They're not running around like chickens with their heads cut off down the aisles. They aren't inciting riots or causing chaos. They're simply just stuck in what appears to be this state of shock. And to be fair, this can happen in any disaster, not just airplanes. It's called behavioral inaction or negative panic. And this actually goes all the way back to episode 6 of our podcast when we were discussing risk matrix. Do you remember when we talked about OODA loops?
Yeah.
The observe, orient, decide, act. Because people in these situations have nothing to compare what they are seeing and experiencing to a previous experience. They kind of get stuck in their own OODA loop and it causes them to freeze. Their brain literally cannot process what's happening and it has no frame of reference to take action on. And it's more or less information overload. And they really have no way to process it before their own inaction ends up killing them.
Yeah, I like it. Good work. Throwback to the Risk Matrix episode. So basically, what you're saying is that the airplane crash is like the rubber ducky getting thrown at them.
It is. It really is. That is their quack bang grenade
That's
to
the quack
to
bang.
go with
That's
fat
what it was
electrician.
called. Is the quack bang? That's exactly right. But it's funny. We kind of seem to keep coming back to that Risk Matrix episode, and I'll be honest. Like that wasn't my episode. That was yours, Chris. You put that thing together. That was really came from your experience. And when we did it, I was like, that is the most boring episode we're ever going to do. And it was. Don't get me wrong. It was pretty boring, but it's so incredibly important because you have to go back to that risk matrix and really figure out like what is it that you are prepping for. In my case, the airplane crash, it's on my risk matrix. That may not be for everybody, but you talk to people about, people say this to me now that we're big famous podcasters, but people ask me, they're like, hey, I'm not a prepper. I like the podcast. Where should I start? And unfortunately, like I can't tell you where to start because you need to go assess your own risk matrix. You need to tell me where you should start. I can say, I don't know, always have a half tank of gas in your car. but I don't know what your risk matrix looks like. So I really can't recommend certain things for you, right? I mean, we keep going back to that, and it's pretty awesome.
It's a tough one to pick your starting point, but that's a really good basic starting point. And understanding what your own day to day and worst case scenario risks are is going to help you develop a plan and pick a starting point. So, yeah, it's boring, but you can make it fun with your family. It just needs to be done.
Yeah, but that's really where prepping starts. It starts what's building block square one. It's your individual risk matrix, and it's crazy that I wasn't I didn't swallow the risk matrix Kool-Aid until now. We just bring it up all the time because it's right. You're so right that you need to kind of assess your own individual risk matrix, and air crashes are something that are on mine. But also, yes, I'm going to reference that book, The Survivors Club by Ben Sherwood. I'll reference that a lot here, and like his interview with cabin safety investigators with the FAA, who they're pretty blunt about who survives air crashes.
Yeah, it's young, slender men. So
Yeah,
agility and strength can literally mean life and death when crawling through airplane wreckage and getting through, those 20-inch wide emergency exits. And I know it sucks, but we do need to talk about how health and fitness are a prep, especially when you need to escape something like a burning airplane. That's kind of part of life when it happens.
yeah. I mean, you do, and we should probably talk about maybe doing like a health and fitness episode. I mean, I definitely have some fitness goals. I'm not saying I'm in the best shape. I would love to be in better shape, but when you look at things like this, that we take all the touchy feely stuff out of it and we say, who survives airplane crashes? Well, young, slender men who are in shape. Like that's rough.
It is, and it's the stats that are backing it up. We're not just saying that because we're those young slender men. I
Right.
definitely do not fit in that category because my physical fitness is abysmal at this point, especially when you compare it to my time in the army.
Right. Sure.
But
I imagine. Yeah.
there are even height differences that come into play when you're trying to get out of an
Of
airplane.
course.
Anyone over 6 foot, they're going to have a more difficult time getting out of an airplane. That includes me. I'm six
Yeah.
foot three.
That's
I'm
right.
fucked.
That's right. So it's these are cold hard facts, I think is what you call those. But
Yes.
right? Yeah. So, let's start from the beginning and talk about what to do on an airplane, from buying your ticket all the way from arriving at the airport, your EDC loadout, and what to do if there's actually some kind of issue. So, and this comes from my experience. This is something I do literally every day, but you're booking your flight. So obviously, the exit row probably going to be one of the safest places to be. But airlines do charge extra money for these seats often. If you're not a frequent flyer like me, you're probably paying for those. So what they say is within 5 rows of an exit is best. 2 rows is ideal. And this was something out of Ben Sherwood's book, that air crash survivors typically move 5 rows or less before they egress the airplane in an emergency, meaning that people that have to move 6 rows, they do not egress the airplane. So they say the rear of the airplane can be safer. There's some articles about that. I think there's honestly data that suggests it may or may not be, depending on the type of impact. Like if you're going to land on the belly, you may be in a better position in the middle of the airplane. Obviously, in a nosedive, you're in a bad position in the front of the airplane. But it really depends on how that air crash and impact are going to happen. But regardless, honestly, you're more likely to miss your connection than you are to be involved in an air crash based on the statistics that Chris gave us at the beginning. So I would always opt for the front of the airplane so you can get off quicker in a not emergency and not miss your next flight. But
That makes sense.
you know what I mean? And maybe the one thing I would say, if besides, 2 rows from an exit, I would also say maybe not a bulkhead seat. According to the experts, in an impact, unfortunately, you're just going to hit something. And the seat in front of you is going to give a little. That bulkhead wall is not. So that would be something else I would pick.
Don't the seats have like specialty springs in them so they kind of give forward when you hit from behind or something
Yeah,
like that?
that's the idea. Aviation seats are actually amazing. There's some amazing tech there that, yeah, they are designed to give a little bit. That's exactly right. So, let's talk a little bit more about, okay, you're getting dressed in the morning. What do you wear? This is important. Closed toed shoes, long pants, cotton layers, because we know that synthetics can melt against your skin in a fire or a high heat situation. Chris, I know you like to wear high heels. No high heels. Sorry, but you got to wear lace up.
Oh,
I'm telling you, man, you got to wear the lace up athletic shoes. Those are best. If you're a high heels type person, wear flats. Running through burning metal and broken glass barefoot, that also kind of sucks. So the lace up athletic shoes, they say leather shoes. I've talked before about why I don't wear leather shoes traveling. That's just because I don't like to talk to people. But and then and then let's talk about your luggage. So whether you check a bag or not, there are some things you can bring on the airplane. If you have medications, it honestly might be best to have those on your person or in your purse that you have on you, because if you evacuate, you aren't going to take anything. You're not going to take that backpack with you out of the overhead. Um, have a flashlight, just a small one. I carry a separate flashlight from my cell phone light. Um, and even though there's emergency lighting on airplanes, uh, it's it's remarkably dark when they do lose power. Like it's dark having that, and it's going to be smoky oftentimes. And then when you board the airplane, there's some stuff going on behind the scenes too.
and I do have a question for you, AC.
Sure.
And this is, I know we talked about, EDC through TSA,
Hmm.
but before we move on, do you get any type of special treatment? Like, oh, we know you're a pilot, you're a certified aircraft pilot, you get a little bit extra leeway going through TSA.
No, it's interesting. You don't like so whether you're a pilot or not, yeah, you don't get anything special. Now I have TSA pre-check, which gets you through a little quicker, and I can get through pretty quickly. But one of the thing that's kind of funny is, um, I have a card that gets me on secured ports. It's called a TWIC card, Transportation Worker Identification Card, I think, because I do a lot in the maritime environment, offshore and things like that. And so if that airport is like a secured port, then you could get on that not through TSA, but you could get on that somewhere else, or something this is really funny too. Like at a major airport, I could fly my own airplane in, and then I could just get out of the airplane and I could probably walk over to the Boeing 737 sitting there, like on the airport side. It's just kind of funny. Like eventually someone should stop you, but it's not like a gate, like where the general aviation aircraft park and the big airplanes. There's no security there. So yeah, going through TSA, nah, man, I'm just like everybody else. But flying in, I could fly into any major airport in my airplane, get out of the airplane. I could walk right over to those airplanes. That's
So
kind of fun.
you would have basically instant, unfettered access to the tarmac until somebody notices you
That's
walking
right.
across with your carry-on, and they're like, "Hey, what are you
Yeah.
doing?"
Oh, yeah. I mean, we probably shouldn't tell the terrorists what to do, but man, you could if you had a super reflective vest and you just flew your own airplane in, got out, and then walked over, not trying to hide. I think they'd just let you. I mean, I don't think they'd stop you.
That dude, he's got the reflective belt.
It-
He's safe.
he's official. He's got the reflective thing. But anyway, like I was saying, there is some stuff going on behind the scenes when you do board the airplane.
And you're talking there about ABP, right?
Yeah, that's right. The able-bodied passengers. So the flight attendants, they are actually sizing you up when you board that airplane.
I've always kind of suspected that because, and from what I've read, able-bodied passengers, they're a lot of the time solo travelers without family. They're kind of the ready to help. They look like or dress like military or law enforcement or firefighters, EMTs. They're kind of that alert and healthy. And flight attendants are also looking for suspicious and intoxicated passengers, aren't they?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, yeah, they're looking at you and I when we board the plane in our cargo pants and our 511 shirts, and they're like, those guys are going to help me if something goes down. I mean, it's honestly, it's yeah, they are totally profiling you 100%.
And they're doing it during the flight safety brief too, because they want to see how much attention you're actually paying, whether you know the exit procedure. I mean, even if you're not sitting in the exit row, are you looking at the little flight or plane data card? Because some emergency
Hmm.
exits open upwards, some come out completely, some you pull the door in and it kind of lays across the seats. So they're looking to see if you're reading the safety card. When not to open certain exits, like if you see water or fire, things like that, right?
That's exactly right, and that's a great point. I'll tell you a story. Once I was sitting in an exit row, and the flight attendants, they have to brief the exit row every time. They have to say, "Hey, are you willing and able to help in case of emergency?" And you have to answer in English. You can't just nod. So you have to say yes. And there was a guy sitting next to me, and he had his headphones on. He's just like, "Yes." And she was just kind of done with his shit. And she goes, "Okay, smart guy." She said, "Tell me what to do with the exit door, with the little, the emergency exit hatch." And he goes, "You just take it out and you throw it out the window." And she goes, "Not on this aircraft, sir. That would pop the emergency slide. You take it out and you lay it across the seats." So they are actually all different. And it's kind of funny. That's exactly right. They are different, and you have to read that dumb little safety card. So that's another thing, is making sure you're reading the safety card. Now it sounds silly, but no, they are all different, and the way to egress the airplane is always different. Um, and when you are seated on that airplane, this is an important one. Um, when you're taking off or landing, remember the +3 -8 rule. And I think I talked about this in the EDC through TSA episode, but the +3 -8 rule in aviation refers to this super critical period of flight where the majority of crashes occur, encompassing the first 3 minutes after takeoff, that's your +3, and the last 8 minutes before landing, that's your -8. So pilots are advised to be extra vigilant during these specific times, as the risk of an accident is significantly higher. Something like 80% of all air disasters happen during these 11 minutes. And similar to that disaster we just saw in DC, right? This was an aircraft in that -8 time, established on final at 400 feet. That was in this very critical 11 minutes. So in that super critical 11 minutes, just don't zone out, don't sleep, don't have your music cranked up super loud in your headphones, and have your shoes on. This is so important because people always get on the airplane. First thing they do is take their shoes off because they want to be comfortable. I get that. But in these 11 minutes, put your shoes on, because there will almost always be fire involved if you survive the smoke inhalation. The heat and the fire on your bare feet will absolutely kill you. So that's a big one.
I am
Um,
100% guilty of this because I have like gotten on to the airplane, sat in my chair, buckled my seatbelt, and just immediately racked out and not
yep.
woken up until we were at the landing gate.
Yep. I've done it too.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm missing that entire 11 minutes. I'm missing the whole flight at that
But
point.
yeah, that's the critical time. It's that +3 -8. So, the crash and brace positions, this is super important to know them. They're in the safety card, and it's so funny. They will actually save your life. They've done so much work with crash test dummies, and these little, crash positions, they will absolutely save your life. And lastly, here's the thing. If you are involved in a crash, know where the nearest exit is beforehand. Know where your flashlight is. Have your little tiny flashlight in your pocket, because it's going to fill up with smoke and it's going to be dark. Have the flashlight ready to go. And do not grab your fucking luggage. Like so many times, I'm telling you, man, you see this amateur footage of these air disasters, these crashes, and there are these self-important businessman douchebags sliding down the wing with their briefcase in their lap. And this slows you down, and that can kill you, and that can kill me. And I do not want to die. So if I am in an air crash and I see somebody grabbing their stuff out of the overhead bin, I'm just gonna donkey punch you, man. Like, just don't do that. And if you guys remember that singer Aaliyah, remember she died in an airplane crash in the
Yep, yep.
Bahamas, and that airplane was overloaded. The center of gravity was off, and her luggage literally killed her. So don't let your luggage kill you. Just leave it. And then obviously, help people off the slides, get away from the wreckage, that kind of stuff. The airplane is likely full of fuel and it will burn. Anytime you see an airplane crash and no post crash fire, it means there was no fuel in the airplane. That's what happens. Airplanes, when they crash, they do burn 100% of the time unless they ran out of gas.
And this is all really good stuff. This is a very broad overview because obviously all airplanes are different. So let's talk about some real world stories. I mean,
hmm
have you ever had a crash either as a pilot or as a passenger?
No, I've been very lucky, knock on wood. I have had some emergencies. I have been a passenger during some declared emergencies. I'll talk about those a little bit. And I have, as a pilot, I've had minor issues where I've requested priority landings and things like that, but I have never had an air crash. Not knock on wood, man.
How have I had more air crashes than you?
I'm gonna guess the Army. Is it the Army?
It is.
Okay,
But
yeah.
how?
Yeah,
Because
I know.
so I have been in an aircraft
Okay.
incident. It was a CH-47 Chinook, which big ass helicopter.
Yep.
If you have not seen them, or don't know what I'm talking about, it's the big cargo helicopters with the front and tail rotors over the top. So the big ones that spin, they're they're workhorses. They're massive, massive helicopters.
The only
But
helicopter that can have an in-flight collision with itself.
yes, and I think it is the only helicopter with an actual classified top speed
Oh wow,
because
really?
they are incredibly fast. But we were coming in for a landing off of a training exercise, and about 125, 150 feet off the ground, and all of a sudden we heard this big thunk come from the back rotor, and apparently the gearbox just decided it was time and it shredded itself, and that rear rotor locked up, and so we started spinning because of the torque involved, and came down relatively hard, not terribly hard. We weren't that high off the ground, but it buckled the landing gear, which kind of shreds the FRH, or the flame resistant hydraulic fluid lines, and it was just everywhere. So it was just a big mess. We landed upright. It crumpled the landing gear, and it took about 3 days for that helicopter to get off of that landing pad.
Oh
But
wow.
it just smells like absolute dog shit. It's terrible. But we used to practice when I was stationed in Hawaii. Anytime we would go over from Schofield Barracks to Pahakaloa Training Area, PTA, on the Big Island, we would take helicopters. And before we were allowed to do that, we had to train for helicopter water landings in Blackhawks. So they get the sample, or the Blackhawk fuselage that's all cleaned out and sterilized and stuff like that, and they load you up and basically put you in the pool as a dunk tank. And the weird thing about helicopters is they're top heavy. So as soon as that fuselage hits the water, the entire thing wants to flip over. So
They always roll. That's right. Yep.
they dump you in the water, and then they flip you upside down, and then they say, "Okay, get out." And it's a very, very odd experience the first time you do it. But then as soon as you're done and you get out of the water, you're like, I want to do that again. That was fun.
It's funny. So I have done that, the dunk tank thing. So it's funny, in order to fly in a helicopter offshore to oil rigs, you actually have to have that certification. I forget what it's called, but I have done that, the dunk in the pool. But they did it. It's just like a chair they strap you into, and then they just dunk you. You just fall backwards into the pool, and you have to get out of your seatbelt type thing. And then there's just 1,000 divers there in the pool. And if you just make the praying sign with your hand, then they come do it for you. So I simulated. I did die. But 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 I still got to get on the helicopter. So anyway, but I've been lucky enough to have never been involved in a crash, but I have had my fair share of minor emergencies, both as a pilot and a passenger. And I do want to talk about some of the things that are going on in the cockpit during emergencies that don't end in a fiery ball of wreckage, just so you know what's going on kind of in the cockpit. And I'll give you some real life examples. I've been lucky enough, to have never had to actually declare an emergency as a pilot. Although I've asked for priority landing a couple of times. I was picking up ice pretty bad one time on an instrument approach in the clouds, and I just told them exactly that. I told ATC I was picking up ice, and they gave me priority, but I didn't have to declare an emergency. But just so everybody knows, when they declare an emergency, it usually isn't the end of the world. And I have actually been on several commercial airplanes when they have declared an emergency. And, one thing to note that declaring an emergency is not the same as a mayday. A mayday is a distress call. A mayday is a very specific call. You tell anyone who's listening who you are, where you are, who's on board. You just say, mayday, 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 United 571 over the Newburgh VOR descending on 5,000, 400 people on board or something like that. And that's a mayday call. But declaring an emergency is not a distress call per se. It's basically, it just allows the aircraft to receive priority handling from ATC. So it allows them to quickly access the nearest suitable airport and necessary support. It basically just allows ATC to mobilize resources to, to help out the airplane.
So that sounds like a very big government-y way of approaching it. It almost sounds similar to what we talked about in the Waffle House Index about how government, stepping up response and cutting down their reaction time. That's their immediate, like, nope, this is cutting the line and everything takes priority, right?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly right. So when you declare an emergency, it doesn't mean the airplane is going to crash. It just means that they need a larger government response than they would normally get. Something like losing an engine on what they call an ETOPS airplane isn't the end of the world. ETOPS, it basically means extended operations, ETOPS. You'll see it on the side of a airplane sometime. It just means that airplane can fly longer than 60 minutes to an alternate airport on one engine. So basically, this is a mandate for twin engine aircraft to fly over the water. They call it ETOPS. And one of the funny the funny acronym that pilots say is they say it's engines turn or passengers swim. That's kind of funny, but ETOPS, it's just extended operations. So, regardless, in an emergency, the pilot will declare it, and then you'll hear ATC on the radio say they'll ask for fuel remaining and they'll ask for souls on board.
Do they actually say souls on board?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. ATC asks for souls on board to inquire about the number of people, passengers and crew on the aircraft, using this historical sort of nautical term where souls refers to the number of living people on board, which is particularly important, in an emergency situation to inform rescue efforts and, kind of accurate, so they can accurately assess the potential number of people needing assistance. And I actually asked once, I remember in ground school, like, this whole thing, if there's a weird thing they say about it's the living people on board. And I don't know if this is true or not, but my instructor had said basically, because commercial airlines, they carry human remains a lot. They say souls because they want to know how many living people they're looking for. Because you could just have a bunch of dead bodies scattered that were already dead when they got on the airplane.
Gotcha.
So I don't know if that's true or not. It might just be a dad fact, but it just sounds kind of cool. So I like it.
So they know how many people they should be searching for in the water that are flailing their arms around. And
Right.
if that number doesn't match what they actually find, now they're looking for
Right.
cadavers.
Right. That's exactly right. So now I've been on a couple of flights where, emergencies have been declared, and it was never a big deal, but you can see why they declared an emergency. There's one, it's funny. I don't know if you've ever heard this, Chris, and I'm going to try to do my best impression of it, but they call it the barking dogs. It's this weird sound you hear on an Airbus. If you've ever, it's like, sounds like this, like, have you ever heard that on an airplane?
Yeah, it kind of sounds like a seal barking.
Yeah, exactly. And they call that the barking dogs. But what that is on Airbuses specifically, it's caused by there's a power transfer unit which moves hydraulic power between systems when the hydraulic pressure is low. So that's why you usually hear it at the beginning or end of the flight, because the pressure is low and the dogs bark. So I was sitting on the ground over the wing, because you usually hear it over the wing. It's right there. It's in the wing, that power transfer pump. And I was sitting next to another pilot who he was actually a commercial pilot for a different airline. And the airplane starts up, and as we're taxiing back, the dogs are barking way longer than I would have thought. And I remember him and we both kind of looked at each other, because it was making that noise just for kind of longer than the normal 5 or 6 seconds. But it was no big deal. Plane takes off, and sure enough, it had a hydraulic issue. And the pilot came on and said, "Hey, we've got a hydraulic issue, and we're going to have to hang out here." And the airplane was over its max landing weight because it was full and it was a long flight. And they can't dump fuel. Regardless of what they say in the movies, a lot of airplanes actually can't dump fuel anymore. Like the big ones, 777s, 747s, they can. But the common narrow body airplanes, we were on a Airbus A320, but like those 757s, they actually can't dump fuel. So what they have to do is fly with the engines at higher power, and then they'll put the gear down to have a bunch of drag so it can slow them down. And we just had to fly around. It was very loud because we had to fly around with the gear down and the spoilers up at full power so they could bleed off enough fuel before we could go back and land in Miami. But the pilot did declare an emergency. And it was kind of funny that it ended up being a hydraulic issue, because this pilot and I next to each other, we kind of thought that there might have been an issue just because of the length of time you heard that hydraulic transfer unit, which is just kind of interesting.
So most modern aircraft can't do the Die Hard 2 bleed off
Yeah,
fuel and create runway lights, right?
exactly. Yeah, that dumping fuel thing is a little more antiquated, and newer airplanes just can't. But there's reasons to be able to do that, because airplanes generally, commercial airplanes, they'll have a heavier maximum takeoff weight than their heaviest maximum landing weight, because of the amount of stress on the landing gear when you land. So they have to bleed off some fuel. Another time, this is kind of interesting. So I was flying out of PDX, and we lost some kind of electronic bus, some sort of system. I'm not exactly sure what it did, but the crew kept coming to my row and looking out the window. And next time you're on a Boeing or an Airbus, look somewhere just in front of the exit row. You'll see these little black triangles just above the window. And what this little black triangle means is that is the best place to view the wing. And so they needed to come to that row and look out to see whether or not the flaps were down, because whatever system broke wasn't telling them whether or not the flaps were down. So they needed to go visually inspect the wing. And there's that spot on the wing where you do that.
Kind of like your tire pressure sensor not telling you that you've got a flat.
Totally. Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, you don't know. And so they had to come back and visually inspect it. So look, next time you're on an airplane, you walk down the aisle, you'll see that there's a little black triangle there, and that is literally the best view of the wing, so they can see whether or not the spoilers are up, whether or not the flaps are down, things like that. Now, one last
And
thing.
real quick, where is
Mhm.
PDX?
That's Portland International Airport.
Portland. Okay.
Yeah, PDX. Yeah. So one thing that's happened to me a few times, and I know that it's very unnerving to passengers. Um, but I've been on commercial aircraft that had to go around, meaning that for some reason the approach just didn't look good, right? So they're on the approach, they're established on the approach, they're a few hundred feet off the ground. One time at LAX, we actually touched down and took back off. It ended up being a wind shear event where they just couldn't stabilize the airplane on the ground, so they gave it full power and they go around. But essentially, if the approach doesn't look good for one reason or another, they they just go around, and then they have to go all the way out to this initial approach fix, and then you kind of have to try again. But this if this happens to you, generally they don't say anything right away to the passengers. And sometimes passengers will kind of start to freak out. And you have to understand that there's just a ton of checklists going on in the cockpit. Everything in aviation has a checklist. If you're, in a 747 with four engines and you lose an engine, it's not that big of a deal. But the pilot has to lean over to the co-pilot in a cool British accent, say, "Hand me the engine out checklist, please." And they have to go through the engine out checklist, and they have to, go through all these checks. So everything in aviation has this checklist. So that's generally why they won't get back to you when you think something might be wrong. It's not necessarily because the airplane's going to fall out of the sky. It's just because they have all these checklists and all these procedures for everything. So they have to run through all these dumb checklists anytime something happens. And that's kind of before they can talk. Another thing is a lot of airlines have what they call a sterile cockpit policy. And this is kind of interesting, basically meaning that they cannot talk in the cockpit with the exception of radio communication between them and air traffic control under 10,000 feet. So something odd happens, especially like on landing, then no one communicates with the cattle back in Gen Pop, and people sometimes just start to get scared. This is normal because the pilot can't talk to you until he actually, does his checklists, and then they, go through it and they go around and all that kind of stuff. So, that's one thing, is just really keeping in mind that you may not feel like they're communicating with you, and you may think that that is an emergency, but in many cases it is not. It's just procedure. They've got these checklists, and even in a small little plane like I fly, we have checklists. We got checklists for everything. You got a engine start checklist, you've got a shutdown checklist, you've got a cruise checklist, you've got a approach checklist, so all these things. So they have to go through these checklists, and because of that, they're not really communicating with people in the back of the airplane. You know what I mean?
And all of this kind of reminds me of, I'm sure you know of it in the aviation world under different names, but the Miracle on the Hudson
Yeah.
with the pilot Sullivan, and
Yeah.
I think
Sully.
the movie was called Sully.
Yep.
But it checks off so many things that we've talked about, because the +3 -8, so
Yep.
they lost both engines almost immediately after takeoff. They had not cleared 10,000 feet, I don't think.
Nope.
So they probably had the sterile cockpit, and they had to start they lost both engines, so dual engine loss under 10,000 feet, and their checklist and procedure to recover from that or plan for emergency landing was designed for 30,000 feet. So they had to do immediate on the fly recovery, and there was no way they were going to make it back to the airport, much less onto a runway. So, well, I guess the Hudson is straight enough right here. So
Yep.
let's slow down, bury it in the water, and deploy the slides. I actually met someone who and by the time I had met them, her husband, but they were passengers on that flight. And as soon as they got back to dry land, uh, he was like, "Nope, I'm proposing to you right now, because that's never going to fucking
Shit.
happen again. Uh, I've had the ring in my pocket for the past 2 weeks. Will you marry me?" And obviously she said yes, but just one of those like, well, holy shit, that proposal story may never be outdone.
No, that's a good one. And you bring up a really good point about that movie, because I think it was probably pretty accurate. And I like the way they're trying to do the simulations. They're like, "Oh, you totally had enough time to go back to the airport," but they didn't, because they had to run through those checklists. And that's procedure. You got to pull out, okay, engine out. Let's do the restart procedure. You have to do all of that stuff before you make the mayday call and all that kind of like there's just a procedure there. So I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand about general aviation. But there is some other stuff too that you could do. I mean, we talk about this like the more kind of outlandish or out of the box things. One thing, I mentioned this, I think, in the EDC through TSA episode, but you can travel with these smoke escape hoods, and that's something I've heard recommended. It's just this little, like it's like the size of a soda can, and it's a little plastic hood that pulls out of there, and then it filters the smoke, and it's really interesting in these survivable air disasters. If the impact doesn't kill you, it's that smoke inhalation that will. Generally, not even the fire. The smoke is going to get you before the fire. That's one thing to think about. And that's like when they say that in a survivable air crash, those people that survived, they're, 2 to 5 rows from an exit, because that's basically the amount of useful oxygen you have. You can move 5 rows. And the cabins almost always fill up with smoke, and that's when they do training, like you talked about doing the water crash type training in a big fuselage. But anytime you're at a major airport, generally you'll see one of these. It looks like a big metal airplane fuselage, and that's where they do the firefighting. So they teach firefighters how to put out these big fuselages, because they'll go set them on fire, and that's where they'll do some of this egress training for an airplane that's crashed. Because, like I said, 100% of the time, if there is fuel on that airplane, there is going to be what we call a post-crash fire, and that fuselage is going to immediately fill up with smoke. So that's one thing you can do is if you are really scared of this, and like I said, Chris, you gave us the statistics. Your odds of living pretty darn good, but the smoke escape hood is something that you could have. And then, I carry a like a satellite rescue beacon. That's another thing that I always have in my EDC through TSA gear. And really, that's not because I think I'm going to crash somewhere where I don't have cell service. I carry it just in case, I need that backup communication. That's part of my PACE model, is having that little McMurdo satellite emergency communicator. And then I also carry generally the Garmin satellite communicator that you can actually send like satellite texts with. That's something else that kind of always goes on the airplane with me. But I think, do you remember this? I sent you that recently. There was a story about a woman got arrested, I want to say in India, because she had one of those little text messengers.
Yeah, and it's illegal under their country's laws, so she got arrested with it and wasn't allowed to continue her flight, wasn't it? Something
Yeah,
like that?
I think it was whatever country. I want to say it was India, that their version of the FCC didn't approve this little satellite communicator. And anybody that doesn't know what these are, I mean, it's just like it Bluetooths to your phone, and you can send short burst data. So like 144 character text messages over satellite. So if you don't have cell service, you can send text messages. You can send your location over satellite. And I carry one with me all over the world. So I know for sure that I have broken laws somewhere, but I wish I knew if there was some kind of repository for those, like where I could go to find out like where those are illegal and where they're not, because I'd never heard of such a thing. But yeah, that's something that's in my EDC travel loadout. And yeah, in certain countries they're actually against the law to have.
So I know we're coming up on the tail end of this episode. Are you up for a practical thought experiment for our audience to follow along with?
Sure, we could do that. You're just off the top of the head here, huh? Let's go. What do you got?
I am. So I'm
Okay.
going to give you a scenario,
Okay.
and I just want you to, when I say go, I want you to talk through your thought process as it's happening in your head, and
Okay.
exactly what you're doing as it's going through your head, right?
Okay, I like this.
So you are on a flight from SeaTac to LAX.
Mm-hmm.
You are flying on an Airbus A320,
Mm-hmm.
and you are in seat, let's say 15C.
Okay.
You are coming in for landing. It's overcast, but not raining, and about, let's say 72 degrees on the ground. So light crosswinds, not anything huge, but you just had engine failure, and the airplane is coming down from 1,500 feet to ground level, and you don't make the runway.
Mm-hmm.
So, boom, you just hit the ground.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting. So, 15 Charlie, so that's going to be on the port side of the airplane probably, and I believe that's probably going to be on an Airbus. That's going to be right in front of the exit row. So, I would have already known that that exit row is going to be behind me. And the cool thing about the A320, and just so everybody knows, we didn't discuss this. Chris just threw this at me, but luckily I've done this before. So, yeah, the A320 actually has two exit rows back there, which is kind of cool. So it means that everybody behind that row that's like 20 or 21 will go to the exit row behind that one, and everybody in front of that will go to the one forward. So it's kind of cool. If you picture it, there's two exit rows, two ways to egress the airplane in the middle. That means that everybody in the back of the airplane, you're not competing with exit space from them, which is kind of cool. So, you would have already assumed the crash position. Hopefully airplane stayed relatively intact. Chances are the gear was down. It kind of depends. I mean, if you were that low when you lost the engine, the gear would have already been down. And sometimes pilots will retract the gear because you will, with the gear down, they have what they call a dirty stall speed and a clean stall speed. So a dirty stall speed would be when when the gear is down.
Stop. 90 seconds from
What?
impact until your most survivable window
Oh,
is
that's
90
true.
seconds. So I just wanted to kind of give a real-time thought process
That's
experiment.
good.
And I do want to let you finish, because I
Sure.
do want to hear the rest of this. I just wanted to give our audience, that's how long you have to get out of that aircraft if you want to survive. Once it's on the ground, that's how long you've got. So
You're
you
exactly
don't
right.
have that long.
That's really good. You're right. They say that survivability, it's not, you got to egress the airplane in 90 seconds. That's exactly right. And it's crazy. From the time I started talking, 90 seconds is freaking quick. So, one thing to think about, yeah, there's these stall speeds in the airplanes. So sometimes pilots will retract the gear so they can glide the airplane further. Sometimes they won't because they don't have enough time. But let's say that airplane hits the ground, then 15C, that's a pretty good seat, because that means that as soon as the airplane hits the ground, seatbelt comes off, and you're going to just make literally two right-hand turns, a right hand down the aisle and an immediate right out of that first exit row. And you're going to be competing with the other people around you, but you're not going to be competing with anybody behind row like 20, because they all have a different exit to use, which is kind of nice. So you can get out of that airplane pretty darn quick, and then you're going to find yourself sliding down a wing. But yeah, I mean, something like that at that low of an altitude, there's nothing the pilot can do. You just land straight ahead of you. You're not at that low of an altitude in that kind of airplane. You're not going to turn and try to land on a side street or something. You're going to go straight. And ideally, you are close enough to the airport that the airport has its emergency vehicles. They call them ARF vehicles, air rescue firefighter, these ARF vehicles, and they're huge. They're like bigger than a normal hook and ladder truck. So they really don't leave the airports ever. They're these massive vehicles, if you've
They're
seen
the
them.
giant, like, square or angled nosed,
Yep.
bright yellow, foam spitting dragons,
That's right.
right?
Yeah, they have foam, or purple K, they call it, but they have this like, foam specifically for fighting fuel fires, and they generally don't leave the airport. But if something happens that close to the airport, then the port would generally deploy their ARF vehicles. They're too big to go on the roads. They're giant, but yeah, if you're that close, they would probably be there pretty quick, because yeah, you'd have like I said, you would have a post crash fire. But yeah, think about that. The second that airplane lands, if you're conscious, ideally you've assumed the crash position. In that kind of scenario, seatbelt comes off, two right turns. Hopefully somebody's already had the exit open by the time you get there, and then you can assist other people as they slide down the wing. That's the one thing, man. If you look at those wings not having a anyone that doesn't have like an escape slide or something like that being on the wing there, it's far off the ground. Like, you could absolutely hurt yourself if you were not an able-bodied person sliding off the back of an airplane wing. So, being able to help other people as they get on the ground, that's going to be imperative. Because you think about, older people, frail people, smaller people, they're going to have a really hard time egressing off the wing of an airplane when it's on the ground.
Even an able-bodied person, if the landing gear isn't crumpled and you're
Yep.
a lot closer to the ground, you're snapping an ankle quite possibly.
100%. Oh, absolutely. No, you're far enough that, and think about just the way you're gonna slide off that airplane is you're sliding off kind of feet first, like not the way you would want to jump if you could. You would want to, like, hang from your arms and minimize the space between your feet and the concrete before you let go. You can't do that. You're just gonna slide down and hopefully not hurt yourself.
Yeah, and at that point, it's an ankle, it's an
Yep.
arm, it's a wrist, it's some ribs. Get off the fucking airplane
Get
and
off the airplane.
survive.
Yep, that's
The
exactly right. Don't take your stuff, and hopefully before that airplane is stopped and full of smoke and pitch black, hopefully you know where that nearest exit is, and you know how to egress that airplane, and you know where your contingency exit is. Because, like you said, Chris, if you look out that window and you see flames or water, then you're not going to open that window because you could be instantly incinerated or drowned.
and there may be competition for that. Like you
That's
said,
right.
you're taking two rights, but there may be competition coming up from behind from people who haven't paid attention. So
Yeah.
maybe you turn to go right and, oh, there's 30 more people that have already left their seats and are clamoring for that exit. If I turn left and just have a little bit of situational awareness, that one's completely open and clear. So I'm going to that one.
Yeah, and to your point, think about an airplane of that size. Most airlines would allow somewhere around 40 minutes for boarding. They like to close the aircraft doors 10 minutes before they take off. So let's say under normal circumstances, it would take them about half an hour to board that airplane. And you're talking about everybody off the airplane in 90 seconds.
A minute and a half. And
The
I truly do
orders
appreciate you participating in that with me, because I did not give you any fair warning that that's what I was going to do.
But you're absolutely, I mean, think about that. Orders of magnitude less time to egress that airplane than it took you to get on that airplane. So if you think about those things, think about, where the exit is and where that backup exit is, and have everything that you may need to survive that situation already in your pocket, because you're not opening those luggage compartments and fishing anything out.
Absolutely. Well, AC, any more tips, tricks, anything else for this episode?
No, that was it. I think that we've given a little bit of actionable information, but also we're not trying to scare anybody here. Like you said, Chris, although it's been a hot button in the news lately, airplanes do not fall out of the sky very often.
I I could not agree more. So take everything that we say with a grain of salt. Understand your own risk matrix, and just think ahead when you board an aircraft. Actually pay attention to that little card that they've got in the seat back pocket in front of you. Pay attention to the flight attendants. And in my experience, if you're nice to the flight attendants, they're going to be nice to you. And you get the extra treats, you get the extra snacks, you get the extra drinks and the little bit longer drink service. But
Mm-hmm.
just think about your scenario, your surroundings, who's around you, and what could happen. And you're going to be better off than 90% of the other people on that flight.
No, that's exactly right. Now, just being aware. We say this all the time, but it's simply being aware of your surroundings, and that's what prepping is. It's preparing, and Taking a trip on an airplane should be no different. You have to prepare. You have to think about it from the moment you even go to plan the trip, to plan how long between connections, to buying your ticket, to boarding the airplane. It's all about being prepared and, having situational awareness before you need it.
Couldn't say it better myself. Well, be sure to join us next week. Completely new topic as always. But until then, remember you are your own stakeholder.